Welcome to the Learner Center Collaborative podcast. I am here today with a colleague of mine, Lázaro Sánchez. He is here today to talk with us about learner agency, all things about equalizing the power dynamics in the classroom, giving our learners voice and choice in their experiences. I can't wait to dive in. Welcome, Lázaro.
Thanks, Kelsey. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here today.
Great. So before we get started, I'd love to share a little bit about who you are, what your background is, and how it brought you to the work you're doing today.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I believe you mentioned, I'm a partner success lead with Learner Center Collaborative. I also work in technical integrations for the couple of learning management systems and platforms that our partners use. On a day-to-day basis, I'm essentially supporting partners through the implementation of those platforms. But what brought me to Learner Centered was essentially my experience as an educator, really diving into understanding aspects of learner-centered education that I really wanted to just impact on a larger level than just the classroom.
And so what's some of your experiences that you've collected to bring you here today?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was younger in high school, every summer I would teach at my old alma mater, George Jackson Academy in the Lower East Side. They're an all-boys school here in New York City, where I'm located currently. And that's where I would jump in as a teaching assistant, helping teachers just work with my younger brothers, is what I would call them. And I really got the feel for just being in front of the classroom, working with students, collaborating with them. And then eventually after college, I jumped into Teach for America to work as essentially a humanities teacher at a charter school in Brooklyn. I worked with 8th graders for 2 years. And then after that, I jumped into the private school world here in New York City, working as a humanities educator.
Great. Well, I am really looking forward to getting your take on learner agency. But before we do that, one of my favorite questions is asking a little bit about your why. And so my question for you is, why learner-centered? Why do you think it's important, and why is it a game changer for you in the field of education?
Yeah, my biggest why is that learner-centered education has the ability to democratize education, democratize the knowledge. I feel like for a large portion of my own educational experience as a learner, I felt, just to use this word, gate-kept from the experiences that I really wanted to jump into. And I only think about, or not only think about, but I think about how different my experience would have been if these arbitrary blockers and walls weren't put up around my educational experience. So I think my big why is working with schools, educators, and families to sort of identify what those blockers are and start tearing down those blockers.
Yeah, I love that. I love this idea of learner-centered education having the ability to make knowledge available to all of our learners, whether that's our adult learners or our young learners. I agree. I think, my own history in education was very much so the dynamic of I was the beholder of knowledge, and my students had to comply, obey, and do certain things at a certain pace and time for me to gift them knowledge, which the more I grow up, the more I'm like, one, that's not the way the world works. Like, everyone has access to knowledge all the time. And two, I wasn't teeing them up to be successful in accessing that knowledge or knowing how to sift through it, prioritize it, leverage it. Yeah. And so it's really interesting.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, Kelsey. I think it's sort of that distinction that, and this is something that fell on my end when I was a learner, but education is sort of, and for the longest time has felt like something that happens to you rather than something that you have a say in and actively participate in. And I don't mean just like the traditional participation of a student raises their hand and answers a question, but really understanding like, hey, what are the outcomes I'm expecting out of my own growth and progress? And what are the steps I'm going to take to get there, and how am I going to just leverage the resources, not just in my school, but in my community, my family, my friends, resources out in the internet to meet my specific goals, right? And maybe my goals aren't exactly tied to what book we're reading in the classroom. Maybe it's something I have a larger question around. Maybe it's something around law. Maybe it's something about something that I'm truly passionate and interested about. So I think that's the thing that drives me to learner-centered education, is the ability to switch that power dynamic. And I think a lot of educators are waiting and wanting for that shift.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we know learner-centered is important. We both care a lot about it. One aspect of it is agency, is allowing our learners or empowering them to have this agency in the classroom, outside of the classroom as well. And how are you defining learner agency right now?
Yeah, I think it definitely goes back to what I mentioned, but I think, again, education for the longest time for me, and I think for many others, they would agree, has felt like something that happens to you. It's something passive. And I think that when we're talking about learner agency, is the ability for those stakeholders to take the learning into their own hands, to be active participants in that learning process, and clearly define those outcomes that they want to achieve, right? And when I say stakeholders and I say learners, I'm not just limiting that to our students. I think definitely students and children around the country are feeling and wanting this shift, especially after the few couple of years we just had, especially behind screens. But I'm also talking about stakeholders like family members, community members that really participate in that learning, right? We want the conversations that are happening in the classroom and the learning that's happening in the classroom to extend outside of that. They don't end there once, you know, the bell rings. It's a process that keeps going, and that our learners feel like they have a part in.
So before, I'm going to ask you about some examples, because I think it's really nice to have like tangible examples of what this looks like. But I guess my question to you before we get into those examples is, how did you shift your own mindset from more of that sage on the stage, I have the knowledge, you have to get it from me, to the other end of the spectrum, which sometimes can feel chaotic, right? It can feel like this release of control that you've been made to feel like is very important to you being a successful teacher. What was that unraveling or unlearning like for you?
Yeah, so I think I think unraveling is the perfect word for it, because I think it happened in layers and stages for me. I may have mentioned this, but I feel like my educational experience as a student when I was younger, I wasn't able to process or unpack that until I was actually an educator in the classroom, and really thinking about and contextualizing how my work as an educator was reflective of my experiences and what the limiting factors were. So just thinking about my charter school experience, again, very grateful for just working and being able to work in front of students with just very limited background in education. But the prescriptive curriculum that I was given, I could see students sort of tap out of that. And after a point, I was tapping out of it, because I didn't see how I, as an educator, was growing in my practice. I was only seeing how arbitrary numbers like a state exam score was being impacted by my experiences in the classroom. And then after I had that experience, I thought to myself, when did I actually have an opportunity as a learner where I felt super successful and I felt like what I was learning in the classroom was applicable to my own life experiences? And I thought back to my Spanish class in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So I had the same teacher, Mr. Aviles, amazing teacher, great guy. And he realized that after a certain point, I'm a native Spanish speaker. So after a certain point, and so were the majority of my classmates as well, there wasn't much Mr. Aviles could teach us about language. So he had to involve our voice in the classroom and really pay attention to the things that we were interested in, and also share his interests to involve us in that process. So I remember in 6th grade watching Pan's Labyrinth, which is definitely not a typical movie you show 6th graders because of the age rating, but Mr. Aviles made sure to share that with our families. But it was the first time I had ever started to see where the historical context we were getting in class from Mr. Aviles in Spanish was applied to this other medium. And I started to see the intertextuality between what I was learning and things out there in the world. And then I very quickly found my favorite director, Guillermo del Toro, if you're familiar with Pan's Labyrinth and his filmography. And I think a lot about this experience, but I borrowed Mr. Aviles's copy of Pan's Labyrinth and didn't give it back until the end of the year, and just kept watching it and kept learning about film and trying to understand and unpack the story while also using my Spanish language skills. And that made me interested in more films and more of his filmography and more of that genre. So I think about that experience in particular because that was a moment where my voice was involved and learning happened not just in the classroom, but outside of the classroom. And I had the resources from my experiences in that classroom and the confidence and the want to just go out and share this learning with my family members. You know, my mom probably got really tired of watching Pan's Labyrinth, but it was an experience that I thought was valuable. And that was something that I think helped me move the needle in my educational experience after I had just had that teaching experience that was very prescriptive.
Appreciate it. I think it's so great to hear us harken back to experiences that we've had where it's very obvious to a learner when your voice is included and when it's not. You know, I can't think of a moment where I've asked an adult learner and said, well, when was your voice included when you were a kid? And everyone knows that moment. They know that educator. That for me, it was dance. It was an teacher that I had in 6th grade. And it was the first teacher in my whole life that asked about me as a dancer, which was a huge portion of my life. And just because we had this connection over a shared interest, I became wildly more committed to show up in that class and learn and have ownership over the learning experience. And so, no, I think it's great to take up the time to share about this experience that you had, because clearly it influenced you as an educator and your passion for agency in the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it just influenced me too as a person, but I think what you mentioned of just how we get our students to show up is definitely with that choice. And I think there was a learning curve after that, after teaching in charter schools. So when I jumped into the private school world, I had a lot of freedom to design and teach a curriculum and build that myself. And sort of decide what were the things that students were being assessed on. So jumped into that experience and I was like, all right, what are the things that are gatekept from us, right? So writing books, I think kids love writing and reading and being able to tell stories. So we're gonna make that happen. But what I didn't realize is that by sort of telling students, hey, you're gonna have the ability to write a book if you'd like, that I was also already just like creating an arbitrary wall for students. So I'm thinking of one student in particular. It was a 5th grader. And in this project, I could see students sort of like tapping out because it wasn't something that they felt they were excited about at first, but then felt that excitement started to wane and it sort of felt like something they had to do. But then one student came up to me and was like, hey, I'm really interested in sort of just video games in general. And then I thought to myself, all right, maybe they can build a video game. And I just asked them, why don't you build that yourself? So there are narrative elements to video games, being able to tell stories. I think about my own experience as someone who really enjoys video games, especially as a kid. I felt like for a long time, in education and my educational experience, it would be that's something you do after you've completed all your homework, right? It's not actually something you can learn from. But the student, a 5th grader, mind you, learned how to create their video game and code a video game and write a narrative for that video game. And then I just thought about, again, and contextualized my own experiences, like what were the steps that I took just now to make that a possibility, or help collaborate with that student so that they could make that a possibility for themselves. And I think that was incredibly powerful for me to see, and also incredibly humbling for my own teaching experiences afterwards, right? Didn't do that book project again. It was more so defining what were the interests that students had, and what were the skills that students were working on that they could apply to larger projects of their choosing. But it was a very powerful learning curve for me.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It sounds like it. And so I'd love to relate this to the work you're doing today. So as a partner success lead, you're working with schools and districts across the country to support this shift through whether it's leveraging technology, professional development, supporting their pedagogy. Is there someone right now in the field that you'd like to share about here, about the work that they're doing to increase learner agency?
Yeah, absolutely. So one partner that I'm very, very excited about, especially in their work around learner-centered practices and learner agency, is Hewitt. They're an all-girls school in the Upper East Side in New York City. Any opportunity I can get to like be in person and work with teachers and faculty is really exciting. But they've spent essentially the previous year, designing their leadership and learning and innovation team, which was comprised of many school leaders, were building out the whole learner outcomes that they would like their students to achieve by the time they jump out and matriculate through Hewitt. So the idea of these whole learner outcomes were outcomes that weren't just applicable in the classroom, they were outcomes that were applicable to life, right? And again, the idea and the habits of being a learner are things that we want to not just apply in the classroom, or things that we want to apply into the real world, right? I'm sure many of us have felt, especially either jumping out of college or jumping out of whatever learning experiences that we've had, that maybe we haven't felt prepared, or we didn't know what are the actual skills we have as individuals jumping into being adults in the real world. But I think what the work that Hewitt is doing is very much preparing students to be to not be passive, to be active in their learning, and to be active and engaging in the world around them, right? So the larger classroom really is the world that they're jumping into, and not just these arbitrary walls that other learning experiences have set up in the past.
Yeah, I love that. And I think the other thing I want to highlight about Hewitt, I had the pleasure of working with them a few years ago. One thing that I love that they're doing there is they're also modeling learner agency with adult learners. So they see their faculty and their educators as folks that should also have agency over their own learning. And so Katie Martin always says it to us, but if we want to shift the way that learners learn, we need to shift the way educators learn. And so that's what I love that Hewitt's doing. It's not saying, here's the graduate profile, go implement it in your classroom. They're saying, what's our collective experience where we can all get on board with this, and you all have agency to shape this as you influence your own classroom.
Yeah. And I think that's incredibly powerful, because it becomes a part of the culture, right? It's not just something that's written in some LMS. It's not just something that you do one summer and move on from. It's something that people are living and breathing, and students feel that. Students are very easy to call out when something doesn't feel right, or something is sort of like not done wholeheartedly. And I think the staff at Hewitt is very much invested in this culture shift and ideology shift on a large level. And I think it's going to pay dividends for their students.
Well, thank you so much for sharing about your own experience, the experience of some of our schools. I do want to, before we close out, I do want to just talk a little bit more about the passion that you have for this. It's very clear to me that you're excited about learner agency. You think it's a really important piece of the work that's happening in learner-centered education. I guess my question to you is, why is it learner agency? Like what becomes possible to you if all of our learners had this agency tomorrow?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, when I'm thinking about learner agency, there's this quote that comes to mind. It's from a proverb. I can't remember if it's an anonymous proverb or where exactly the proverb's from, but it's teachers open the door, but you must be the one to walk through it. And I think when we start to shift to that learner-centered mindset and actually become active participants and apply learner agency to our lives, and students have the ability to do that as well, they start seeing those doors and start seeing doors that they can walk through, right? They also then get the agency to see, why is this door closed? Why am I being prevented from walking through this door? What are the blockers? They start questioning that world around them, and they start to actively participate in that world and advocate for themselves. So I think that's something that we're starting to see a lot in education and just in kids in general. And I'm just excited to see what doors open for students as we shift towards this.
That was very powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm a bit speechless. I just feel like I, agree with everything you're saying. I love hearing the passion that you have for this work, and I feel so grateful to work alongside you and do this work together. We're going to close this out, Lázaro, and we're going to share this with our community so they can learn about your experience, but also hopefully be encouraged to take that first step of shifting some of the power in their classroom and allowing for some more learner agency. So is there anything else you want to share, or are you ready to close this out?
Yeah, no, I just thank you for having me. I love talking about learner-centered education and shifting the needle towards that. And like I said, I think we're all moving, and this world is moving in that direction. And it's just an exciting time to be a part of that direction.
Well, great. Thank you again. And thanks for joining us today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kelsey.